The girl stood at the cafe door with rainwater dripping from the ends of her hair. One hand gripped the handle of a battered crutch, and the other clutched a worn canvas bag against her chest. Across the room, a single father sat with his two kids and stared at her like he'd just glimpsed someone from a chapter of his life he'd spent years trying to forget. She was exhausted, embarrassed, and fighting not to cry. Every table was full except the empty chair beside him, and she'd already been turned away twice that afternoon because people kept looking at her missing leg before they looked at her face. She took one slow step, then another, the rubber tip of her crutch tapping the floor until she reached his table. Her voice was barely a whisper when she asked, "Can I sit here?" The father looked at the chair, then at the frightened girl standing in the rain, and something in him broke open. He pulled the chair out without hesitation and said, "You don't have to ask permission to sit somewhere. You're welcome." The girl froze, her lips trembling, and for the first time that day, she let herself cry. Before we go further, if you believe in kindness, in second chances, in the idea that one small act can change the whole direction of someone's life, hit like on this video and send it to someone who could use a little hope today. Drop a comment, and subscribe to Quiet Kindness Stories, because sometimes the stories that move us most start with people who believe they have nowhere left to go. The girl's name was Maya Bennett. She was 17, though the sadness behind her eyes sometimes made her look much older. 3 years before that rainy afternoon, Maya had been an ordinary 14-year-old who ran barefoot through her grandmother's garden, picked tiny yellow flowers, doodled in the margins of her school notebooks, and dreamed of becoming an artist. She was the kind of kid who laughed too loud and then apologized for laughing too loud, who remembered everybody's birthday, who left little handwritten notes tucked in her mother's purse. Then one winter night, everything changed. A drunk driver crossed the center line on a narrow country road while Maya and her mother were driving home from a school art competition. The crash lasted seconds. The aftermath lasted years. Maya survived. Her mother didn't. After several surgeries, doctors had no choice but to amputate Maya's left leg above the knee. When she woke up, she learned two things almost at once: her mother was gone, and she would never walk the way she used to. The first thing she asked the nurse was whether her mother had suffered. She was told her mother had died quickly. Maya closed her eyes and said nothing. The second thing she asked was whether she'd ever run again. Nobody answered right away. That silence told her more than words could have. Her father had died when she was 6, so after the accident she was sent to live with an aunt she barely knew. Her Aunt Diane already had 3 kids, a husband who worked nights, and a household stretched thin. At first, Diane tried. She drove Maya to appointments, learned how to help with the prosthetic fitting, sat with her through those first physical therapy sessions. But grief wears people down, and before long Maya became the living reminder of a tragedy nobody in that house wanted to talk about. Her cousin stared at the prosthetic. Kids at school whispered. One boy cruelly nicknamed her half-step. Another asked if she still counted as a girl with only one leg. Maya learned to laugh along when people joked about her, because crying only egged them on. She stopped wearing shorts. She stopped swimming. She stopped drawing people because she couldn't stand sketching legs anymore. Worst of all, she stopped asking for help. By 17, she'd perfected the art of making herself invisible. Walking carefully, speaking quietly, apologizing whenever someone had to wait on her. 3 months before that rainy afternoon, Diane's husband lost his job, and the family decided they could no longer afford to keep Maya. They told her she'd be better off in a youth transitional program in the city, at least until she finished school. Diane cried while explaining it. Maya told her it was fine, even though it wasn't. She packed her things into one canvas bag, folded her mother's old scarf at the bottom, and left with $73, a phone with a cracked screen, and the address of a temporary shelter scrawled on a scrap of paper. The shelter was full when she got there. The woman at the front desk apologized and said a bed might open up in 2 days. Maya nodded like 2 days were nothing. She spent the first night at a bus station, the second in a 24-hour laundromat until the attendant asked her to leave. On the third afternoon, she ducked into a small cafe because the rain had gotten too heavy to keep walking. That's where she met Ethan Walsh. Ethan was 38, a widower, father to 2 kids, 8-year-old Jonah and 5-year-old Ava. His wife, Sarah, had died 2 years earlier from a sudden illness that gave no warning and no time to prepare. Ethan had once taught high school history, but after Sarah died he cut back his hours and picked up evening repair work so he could be home with his children. He lived in a cramped apartment above an old bookstore, where the heater rattled at night and the kitchen window never quite shut, but to his kids, it was home. He was the kind of father who packed lunches at 5 in the morning, taught himself to braid hair from a dozen tutorial videos, showed up to every school meeting, and kept emergency crayons in the glove compartment. He'd also gotten very good at hiding his own sadness. He carried a photo of Sarah in his wallet but rarely looked at it, because every time he did, Jonah noticed and asked if Dad was okay, and Ethan had never figured out how to answer that without lying. That rainy afternoon, Ethan had brought Jonah and Ava to the cafe after school because the power in their building was temporarily out for repairs. Ava was coloring a purple house. Jonah was quietly working through a grilled cheese sandwich. Ethan stared out at the rain, doing math in his head about whether his next paycheck would cover the electric bill, Jonah's school shoes, and Ava's medication. He noticed Maya before she noticed him. The crutch first, then the empty space beneath her jeans, then the look on her face. She wasn't asking for pity. That was what struck him. She was trying so hard not to look like someone who needed anything. When she finally reached the table and asked if she could sit, Ethan remembered something his own father had told him as a boy: if somebody looks too afraid to ask for a seat at your table, make room before they have to ask. His father had died when Ethan was 20, but the line had stuck with him for 2 decades. So he slid his chair over, pulled out the empty one, and told Maya she didn't need permission to sit somewhere she was welcome. She sat down slowly. Ava looked at Maya's crutch, then at her face, and asked the kind of blunt question only a child can get away with: "Did you lose your leg?" Ethan gently told Ava it was okay to ask, but that some things were private. Maya surprised them both by answering anyway. "Yes," she said. "In an accident." Ava studied the crutch again and said simply, "That must have hurt." Maya smiled for the first time in days. "It did." Ava nodded like that settled it and went back to her coloring. Jonah, who'd been watching quietly, slid half his sandwich toward Maya and told her she could have it if she was hungry. She shook her head immediately, but Ethan noticed her eyes tracking the sandwich anyway. He nudged the plate closer and told her that in their family, sharing food wasn't charity, it was just dinner. She hesitated, then took a small bite. That bite nearly made her cry again. She hadn't realized how hungry she was. Ethan pretended not to notice when she finished the whole thing. They stayed at the cafe almost 2 hours because the rain wouldn't let up. In that time, Ethan learned Maya was still in high school, that she loved drawing, and that she was trying to figure out how to finish her senior year without a stable place to sleep. He didn't ask where she'd been staying. He didn't ask why she was alone. He just asked what she wanted to do with her life. Maya looked at him like nobody had asked her that in years. Finally she said, "I used to want to be an artist." Ethan said, "Used to." She looked down at her hands and admitted that dreams start to feel embarrassing when your whole life is falling apart. Ethan told her dreams weren't embarrassing, giving up on them because someone made you feel broken was the part that actually hurt. Something shifted in her face. Before they left, Ethan wrote his number on a napkin and told her to call if she ever needed help finding resources. Maya almost refused, but Ava reached over and tucked the napkin into her canvas bag herself. "Now you can't lose it," she said. Maya laughed softly. That night, long after his kids were asleep, Ethan kept thinking about her, where she'd go, whether she was safe, whether he'd done enough. He knew he couldn't just bring a 17-year-old stranger into his home without thinking through the legal and practical realities. So the next morning he called a community youth service center and laid out Maya's situation. He spent nearly an hour on the phone until he found an emergency placement program that could offer her a temporary room, meals, transportation help, and support at school. When he called to tell her, she was stunned and asked how much it would cost. He told her the program was community-funded. She thanked him and hung up. 20 minutes later she called back and asked if he'd really done all that for her. "Yes," Ethan said. She asked why. He glanced at Sarah's photo on his desk and answered, "Because someone should." Over the following weeks, their lives quietly wove together. Ethan helped Maya get settled at the youth center. He went with her to a school meeting when she was too nervous to face it alone. He found out the school had a small art scholarship program Maya had never heard of, because she'd stopped going to counseling and avoided the guidance office altogether. Jonah started leaving drawings under her windshield wiper whenever he spotted her car. Ava insisted Maya come over on Saturdays to help her paint. Maya tried to keep her distance, afraid of becoming a burden, but Ethan kept reminding her that friendship isn't a debt. Slowly, she started laughing again. She picked drawing back up, and one day showed Ethan a sketch of Ava at the cafe table. He stared at it for a long moment. She'd caught something he'd never even noticed, the way Ava pressed her lower lip against her teeth whenever she concentrated. He told her it was beautiful. She shrugged it off, said it wasn't very good. You don't have to be good at something for it to matter, he said. That line stuck with her. But not everything got easier. Maya's prosthetic had started causing real pain, she'd grown, and the old fitting no longer matched her body. The clinic said she needed a new one, but the cost was far beyond anything she could scrape together. She decided she'd just stop wearing it. Ethan noticed her struggling and asked what was wrong. She admitted every step hurt. He got frustrated, not at her, but at how unfair the whole thing was. He started digging through non-profit programs, local grants, prosthetic assistance funds, filling out applications after the kids went to bed. Some got rejected. Others never answered at all. One organization offered partial funding but needed paperwork Maya couldn't get because her legal documents were still tied to her aunt's address. For every door that opened, two more seemed to shut. Maya kept telling Ethan it was fine, that she could manage. Finally he looked at her and said, "You keep saying you can manage when what you really mean is you're afraid nobody will stay if you need too much." Her eyes filled with tears. She admitted that people always left. Her mother died, her father was already gone, her aunt eventually couldn't keep her, friends stopped inviting her places because walking slowly was inconvenient, boys she liked treated her like a tragedy instead of a person. She'd learned that meeting someone just meant eventually losing them. Ethan sat with that for a moment before answering. He told her he understood more than she might think. After Sarah died, he'd convinced himself that if he could do everything alone, his kids would never face another loss. But trying to shield them from pain had nearly turned him into a stranger in his own home. He told Maya that strength isn't refusing help, sometimes strength is trusting someone enough to accept it. She wiped her eyes and said she wished she could believe that. He told her she didn't have to believe it all at once. She could borrow his belief until she found her own. That sentence stayed with her. Meanwhile, Ethan's kids had started loving Maya in their own simple way. Jonah asked her to help with a school art project. Ava started calling her Auntie Maya, which embarrassed Maya and cracked Ethan up. One evening, while Maya helped Ava paint stars on a cardboard box, Ava asked if Maya would ever get two legs again. Maya gently told her no. Ava thought about it and said, "Then you'll just have to make the one you have really awesome." Maya laughed so hard she smeared a purple streak across her own cheek. Watching from the doorway, Ethan felt his apartment feel warmer than it had in years. But just as things seemed to be turning a corner, Maya got a letter from school warning she was at risk of losing her spot over excessive absences. The letter wasn't cruel, but she read it like a verdict. She'd been working part-time bussing tables at a diner to save for transportation, going to physical therapy, and trying to keep up with schoolwork while living in temporary housing. She felt like she was failing at everything. That night, she disappeared. Ethan noticed when she stopped answering his messages. He called the youth center and learned she hadn't come back. Panic tightened in his chest. He remembered the first day he'd seen her soaked in the cafe doorway, fighting not to cry. He drove to every place she'd ever mentioned, the library, the bus station, the Riverwalk, and finally back to the cafe where they'd first met. He found her sitting under the awning, staring at the same chair where she'd once sat beside him. He sat down next to her without asking a single question. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. Then Maya said, "I think everyone would be better off if I just stopped needing them." Ethan's voice went firm. He told her she was wrong. She said she was tired of being the girl everyone had to help. He told her everyone needs help sometimes, including him. She said he had kids and responsibilities and shouldn't have to worry about her too. He looked at her and said, "You think my kids need me to teach them how to survive alone? They don't. They need me to teach them how to care when caring is inconvenient." Maya started crying. He kept going, telling her the world had already taken enough from her, and he wasn't going to let it take the rest. He couldn't fix everything, he said, but he could sit beside her while they figured out the next step. That night, Maya went back to the youth center. Ethan called the school counselor, and together they worked out a modified attendance plan. The community center connected Maya with a prosthetic foundation, and after weeks of paperwork, she was approved for a new leg. When it arrived, she stood between two parallel bars at the clinic, trembling. She took one step, then another. It still hurt, but not in the same way. Ethan stood nearby with Ava and Jonah. Ava clapped so hard the therapist laughed. Jonah shouted, "You did it!" Maya looked at them and cried, not because she'd walked, but because she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have people proud of her for something other than just surviving. Months passed, and Maya's life began shifting in small, quiet ways. She went back to school full-time. Her drawings got displayed in a local community art show. She applied for an art scholarship and got it. She started volunteering at a rehab center for teens with limb differences, where she found she could talk to scared kids in a way adults sometimes couldn't. She understood the embarrassment, the anger, the loneliness, the fear of being stared at. She told them that losing part of your body doesn't mean losing the right to imagine a future. Ethan stayed in her life, but he never treated her like a project. He treated her like family. When she succeeded, he celebrated. When she failed, he stuck around. When she got angry, he let her be angry. When she needed space, he gave it. And when she doubted herself, he reminded her of the girl who'd walked into that cafe with nothing but a canvas bag and a lifetime of pain, and still found the courage to ask for a chair. 1 year after they first met, Ethan brought Jonah and Ava back to the same cafe. Maya showed up in a simple blue dress, carrying a portfolio of her artwork. She'd been accepted into a prestigious art program in another city and had come to share the news. Ava jumped into her arms. Jonah demanded to see the acceptance letter. Ethan hugged her last. She handed him the letter, and he read it slowly, eyes filling with tears, telling her how proud he was. Maya smiled and said, "You know, I almost didn't walk into this cafe that day." Ethan asked why. She said she was afraid people would stare. He looked toward the empty chair beside him and told her he was glad she'd asked anyway. She sat down and said something that made him laugh and cry at the same time. She told him that when she first asked, "Can I sit here?" she wasn't really asking about the chair. She was asking whether there was still a place in the world for someone like her. Ethan looked at her for a long moment and said, "There always was." Maya lowered her head and cried. She'd spent 3 years believing the accident had split her life into a before and an after, like everything beautiful belonged only to the girl she used to be. But now she understood it differently. Her life hadn't ended on that winter road. It had changed shape. The mother she'd lost would never see the woman she became, but Maya learned to carry that memory not as a wound alone, but as a reason to live fully. She began painting a series called Empty Chairs, portraits of people who'd felt unwanted, forgotten, or left behind. The first painting showed a rainy cafe entrance. A young girl standing with a crutch in one hand and a canvas bag in the other, and across the room, a father with 2 children, an empty chair beside him. She painted the chair brighter than everything else in the piece. When people asked why, she told them that sometimes an empty chair isn't proof nobody wants you, sometimes it's proof someone was saving a place for you before you even got there. Years later, Maya became a successful artist and advocate for kids with disabilities. She never forgot that cafe. Ethan eventually opened a small community workshop where teenagers could learn art, woodworking, and practical skills without being judged for their circumstances. Jonah grew up to become a teacher. Ava became a pediatric therapist. And Maya stayed part of their family not because Ethan had rescued her, but because somewhere along the way, two broken families had quietly found each other and learned that love doesn't always arrive through blood. Sometimes it arrives through a chair pulled out from a table. Sometimes it sounds like a stranger saying, "You don't have to ask permission to sit somewhere. You're welcome." And sometimes the person you think you're helping turns out to be the one who helps you heal. Ethan believed he was giving Maya a second chance. But Maya had given him something he hadn't realized he'd lost after Sarah died, a reason to believe a family could grow without replacing the people who were gone. One evening, years after that rainy afternoon, Ethan sat in that same cafe with one of Maya's latest paintings hanging on the wall. Jonah and Ava were adults now, home for dinner. Maya walked in carrying a small wooden frame holding a photo of that original empty chair. She set it on the table and told Ethan she had one last thing to give him, a handwritten note from her mother, found among the things her aunt had kept after the accident. It had been written years earlier but never delivered. It was addressed to Maya, telling her that no matter where life took her, she should never mistake needing help for being weak. Maya read it aloud, and when she finished, Ethan wiped his eyes. She told him she'd spent years thinking her mother left her with nothing. Now she understood her mother had left her with a lesson, that she'd need someone else to help her get here. Ethan smiled and said maybe that's just what people are supposed to do for each other. Carry one another until they can stand again on their own. Maya looked around the cafe, the tables, the windows, the rain starting softly outside, and finally at the chair beside Ethan. Laughing through tears, she asked, "Is this seat still taken?" Ethan shook his head. "For you? Never." And this time, Maya didn't cry because she felt unwanted. She cried because she finally understood she never had been. If this story touched something in you, don't just watch and scroll past. Like the video, share it with someone who still believes kindness matters, and subscribe to Quiet Kindness Stories so more stories about courage, family, forgiveness, and second chances can reach the people who need them most. And before we go, I want to ask you for something. Comment, "There is always a chair for you," if you believe nobody should ever have to wonder whether they still belong. Because somewhere tonight, there might be a Maya standing outside a door, afraid to ask for a place at the table. And somewhere there might be an Ethan who doesn't yet know that one small act of kindness could change two lives forever. Never underestimate what happens when you make room for someone who believes they've been forgotten. You might think you're only pulling out a chair, sharing a meal, or saying a few gentle words. But to someone who's spent years feeling invisible, that moment can become a doorway back into life. And sometimes the greatest miracles aren't the ones that restore what was lost. They're the ones that teach us how to build something beautiful from what remains.